Hey there, Comics Alliance. This is Matt Wilson here once again to share with you a clip from this week's episode of War Rocket Ajax, the podcast that I produce and co-host with Chris Sims, who you know from right here at Comics Alliance. The 20-minute clip you're about to hear several days before the full podcast goes up on iTunes and on warrocketajax.com is of our comics reviews for this week, where we're going to be talking about Batman number 29. We're going to be talking about Hawkeye number 17. We're going to be talking about Magnus Robot Fighter number 1. These were all some pretty good books that came out this week, and I hope you enjoy hearing our discussion about them. Here it is. What do we want to start with? We want to start with Batman 29?
Yeah, let's go ahead and start with Batman 29.
Okay. I really liked this issue of Zero Year. It, I think, is the most self-contained one-issue story of this event so far. It doesn't have a lot of dangling threads, and I enjoyed that greatly.
Look, I love Zero Year. I have been thrilled with it. I'm doing a big series of interviews on Comics Alliance with Scott Snyder about it. I think it's so great in how it diverges from year one. I think it's great for how crazy superhero-y it is. And this issue, I think, is the biggest, most superhero installment of Zero Year yet, because Batman has a super blimp.
Yes, he does.
But it does seem like Zero Year is kind of spiraling into bigger and like a longer and longer story in a lot of ways. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because I am loving it.
Well, I do wonder, because how many issues of this are left? 3 or 4, maybe?
This, I think, is the last part of Dark City, which was the second act of Zero Year. So there are 4 more issues that'll be called Wild City.
Okay.
That will take us back to that scene in the first part where you see Batman riding around on a steam-powered dirt bike. Again, the most superhero thing of all time.
So I'm wondering how it gets to that point of dirt bike Batman. That's my big question in my head. That said, I really like the way the threads tie together in this issue. Because we've had this Riddler holding the city kind of hostage in the storm kind of thing brewing. And then you have Dr. Death kind of on this other side. And this issue finally smashes all that stuff together. A few things I want to go through while we're talking about this. I want to get your thoughts on a few things.
All right, I'm ready.
One, this issue in particular probably has more homages to other Batman stuff than any other issue of Zero Year so far. We have the very clear homage to The Dark Knight Returns, where Batman is jumping through the sky with a lightning bolt behind him and is in silhouette, but instead of blue, it's pink, and he's much thinner, right?
Which I think that's everything you need to know about Zero Year. It's like the Frank Miller stuff, except hot pink.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so there are a couple more lines that are clear references to things. One is when his blimp comes out of the sky and somebody says it's the goddamn Batman.
Amazing.
And then there's another part where he says that his blimp already came in black, which is a reference to Batman Begins.
Right.
Where Bruce Wayne asks Lucius if the car comes in black. I mean, what do you think of those references or homages to those other things? Do you think they're too overt, or do you think they're great?
I really like them. And I think, let's not forget that this whole thing is setting up the next act of the story, which is, at least to me, it's a huge reference to No Man's Land. You see the kind of fake post-apocalyptic Gotham City in the beginning, which is what's coming at the end of this issue when the storm comes and the city floods and everything gets destroyed, and it's a big failure for Batman. But yeah, I think when you're doing a big origin story for Batman, who has had these really, famous big stories in the past, you want to kind of connect everything. I think if the actual meat of the story wasn't as good as it is, I think they'd fall flat. But I think that this story is so good and so enjoyable and so big. And that's another part of it, too, because this story is big and crazy. And, you know, it's a story that opens up with Bruce Wayne flipping off the reader.
Yeah.
This issue in particular has one of my favorite images that we've seen Greg Capullo draw, the GCPD recruitment poster. So you open this up, page 1, panel 1, and there's this faceless criminal pointing a gun right at you, the reader. It's not a subtle story, even by the standards of a Batman comic. So I think throwing all that stuff in really works because it's all supporting something that's genuinely compelling and kind of matches the scale of all that stuff. I think it's the most obvious thing in the world to say that Scott Snyder is a huge Batman fan, and I think you know, I'm sure Greg Capullo is not a Batman fan, you know. So getting all that stuff, I mean, even the drawing of Batman in the cockpit of the giant blimp is kind of like the drawing of Batman in the cockpit of the Batmobile in Dark Knight Returns. You get a lot of that stuff coming through.
There's a lot of Dark Knight Returns in this. Not just the silhouette in front of the lightning bolt, but also the fight with Dr. Death, where he says, "Now it's time to make you hurt."
Yeah, and it's done in those little square panels.
Yeah.
Those little close-up panels. And again, you know, even Dr. Death. Like, Dr. Death is Snyder going back to Detective Comics 42 or whatever it was, you know, back to 1940, and pulling up a supervillain, the very first supervillain, and dropping him into this story. But I think a lot of the stuff is set dressing, but it all works to support the main thing that's going on.
One last question about this.
Yes.
And you brought this up.
You said that so accusatorily.
Maybe I did. This is a story where Batman fails.
Yes.
It's a kind of a joint failure between Batman and Gordon. They both fail in this. And the actual catalyst of the issue is the Riddler, but then also James Corrigan just being an asshole adds a lot to it as well. But Batman and Gordon fail to stop this huge thing, and that's a big difference between No Man's Land and this story. No Man's Land was just a huge natural disaster for which Gotham ended up getting no help.
Right.
This story you can place at the feet, at least some of the blame, at the feet of Batman and Gordon for not stopping it. Like, Batman's Batman 66 Batjammer he loses it, he drops it.
Amazing. Loved it.
So, I mean, what do you make of the failure?
Well, I think the key thing about this issue is that it's Act 2 of 3, you know? This is...
For lack of a better thing to compare it to, it's The Empire Strikes Back.
Right. It's the one where the bad guys win. And I think that's necessary for this kind of story. Like, if we see a story now where Batman loses, and that's the end of the story, I think that's, you know, kind of inherently bad, because I don't think we want to see Batman really lose. But when you're doing Batman's origin, you have to get to a point where the new challenge comes along. In year 1, the new challenge is supervillains, and it happens at the end, because Batman more or less ends organized crime in year 1. Like, he takes out what we would know as crime. He takes out the mob, like, in number 3. that happens. It's over. It's done with. In 0 Year, and this is something I talked to Snyder about, supervillains are already present in Gotham before Batman. The Red Hood Gang is active, and the Red Hood Gang is a supervillain organization by any measure. They wear costumes, they have code names, they pull off crazy pattern crimes. So, supervillains exist. So getting Batman to this point where he has to realize that, you know, it's not random muggers that he's fighting anymore. He's not fighting the crime that he's used to. He had a little taste of victory, but now he has to realize the scale of what he's doing. And I think you get that in this. You don't really get it in year 1 because it's all very implicit. With, you know, this fellow who's going to poison the reservoir calls himself the Joker. Like, we all know what happens after that. Like, we know the next 40 years of comics that come after that scene. With this, the scale changes while Batman is active. You know, it's overconfidence that does it. He rejects help, which I think is a very key thing, and then realizes he's wrong. And I think that the way it's set up with the Gotham kind of being destroyed, that's intercut with the Wayne murders, and the last thing we see in this comic is Bruce Wayne calling for help, is so thematically good, because that's the moment that he never wants to relive.
Right.
It's not just the murders; it's the helplessness.
I think the comparison with Year One. I mean, also Year One is 4 issues.
Yeah,
and this is a much longer story. So,
and also you can't talk about any Batman origin and not compare it to Year One.
Yeah, but the 4 issues isn't a lot of room to tell a big failure and redemption story. This story has a little more room to breathe to do that. And, we're living in an era where it's very rare to see Batman lose.
Yes.
If ever. Like, it's, we don't see Batman on his back all that much. So, seeing that now is different. And also, it establishes that this is a different Batman than the one that exists, 5 years later, however many years later it's supposed to be in the regular
it does a great job of underlining, he's a young, raw Batman, in a way that they like to say that, but they don't really like to show it.
Yeah.
And this really shows it in that way, that you get Batman's big failure. Probably his only big failure ever.
Yeah. The next comic that we're going to talk about is Hawkeye number 17, which is a little bit of a weird issue.
Loved it.
Just to describe it quickly, if you haven't read it, it has an opening page and a closing page that are both drawn by David Aja that have Hawkeye in them. And then everything in between is a holiday special that's on TV that's all drawn by Chris Eliopoulos.
It's the Wintertime Winter Friends Winter Fun special.
Yes, and I saw some people on Twitter saying that they thought this was a waste of an issue of Hawkeye. I do think that it reads not like a sequential issue of a comic. It doesn't read like a number 17. It reads like a Hawkeye holiday special one-shot. That said, it is a hell of a fun read.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't feel like a number 17 that came out on March 12th.
Yeah.
I loved this issue, unsurprisingly.
Eliopoulos is great. He drew Cowboy with Nate Cosby, that Nate Cosby wrote, which is a really good book. He's mostly known for his lettering stuff, but his art is really great. He's done some other all-ages stuff for Marvel. And it's really cool to see his art style kind of being brought into Hawkeye. And what this issue ultimately does is kind of inject some Hawkeye stuff into this Christmas special, holiday special, where the holiday friends, it's about the holiday friends for a few pages, and then all of a sudden it becomes about Steve the dog.
Steve the dog with no powers that gets to hang out with the holiday friends.
Yeah.
The metaphor is not subtle.
And Steve the dog encounters this group of other dogs, or I think they're actually dingoes.
They're dingoes, yeah.
That instead of calling each other bro, call each other dog.
And they wear tracksuits. They're dingoes in tracksuits. I think
so it's not an issue of Hawkeye, but it is an issue of Hawkeye. It's a very metaphorical issue of Hawkeye.
The thing about this issue is that when you look at the last 2 issues we've gotten, assuming that you're talking about them in numerical order and not in release order, because, as you might know by now, 15 and 16 were switched. The last time we saw Clint Barton in the most recent issue for us, number 15, Clint died. Or at least, he looks like he's dead. He looks like he is in bad shape. Getting a flashback right after that, which is a book about how Steve the dog, who is, he's Hawkeye, because he hangs out with the dog Avengers. And there's another little dog that's like Kate, and there's another little dog that's like Barney, who's his brother. That he doesn't. Steve the dog wants to do everything by himself so that nobody else gets hurt. And you go through it, and he seems like he's super arrogant because he's always yelling at the other dogs. And then the Black Widow dog, the Spider-Woman dog, and the Mockingbird dog show up. thematically, getting that as kind of the next Clint Barton story is a really smart way of recapping what's been going on in this book in a way that's not a recap, you know? Thematically, this shows you exactly how Clint Barton ended up at the end of Hawkeye 15, because he wanted to do everything himself so that nobody else would get hurt. It's, you know, it comes off as arrogance, but it's actually this, you know, fear of people around him getting hurt that we've seen him experience as the course of this issue went on. Make no mistake, it is a bizarre issue. Like we said, it's a Christmas special that came out in the middle of March, which makes me mad, because I'm writing a comic and the second issue was going to be a Christmas special and it was probably going to come out in the summer. You know, you can't do anything new.
That said, this issue of Hawkeye is pretty good.
Oh no, it's fantastic. It's fantastic.
Well, you know, if you can get past when it came out and how it is and isn't an issue of Hawkeye, and just enjoy it for what it is, it's really good. The last comic we're going to talk about is Magnus Robot Fighter #1, which is the first issue of the second of the Gold Key revivals that are happening over at Dynamite.
Right, Turok, I believe, came out last week.
A few weeks ago.
Was it a few weeks ago? That's the book that Greg Pak's doing.
Yes, and this one is Fred Van Lente.
Friend of the show.
Yeah.
Friend of the show, friend of the Joes.
And who's doing the art on Magnus?
Cory Smith is the artist.
Yes. I thought this was a really interesting first issue of a book. It's a little Matrixy.
It's very Matrixy.
In its premise, because about halfway through, we find out that the world that Magnus lives in was in fact a simulation. But in that simulation, he kind of lived in peace and harmony with robots. It's different from the Matrix in that, you know, the Matrix was all about people living in a world very much like our own, and it turning out to be a simulation. Magnus's simulation is one where his parents died when he was very young, and he was raised by an artificial intelligence that turns out to be a real artificial intelligence in his world that is kind of broken off from the overriding, you know, computer law or robot law, and trained him and convinced him to be an actual good human being.
There's 3 things I love about this comic, and there's one thing that I don't necessarily like about it. The thing I don't like is that, particularly for Fred Van Lente, who is usually like very, very quick to get to the action, this feels like it is a setup-heavy issue. Which, to be fair, I mean, you know, the title Magnus Robot Fighter, like Chad and I are always joking about how great it is because it says what he does, and it's perfect. Like, who would not want to read a book called Magnus Robot Fighter? But you get the simulation stuff, and then you get introduced to the world. So there is a lot that he has to introduce in this issue, but it does feel like it's, you know, the last page is right when it's getting really good.
And we do see him fight robots.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about it. Like, one of the 3 things that I love about it is that you do see him karate chop a robot's head off.
Yeah, I mean, it's not one of those comics where the title character doesn't do what the title character does until issue 4 or something like that. He's fighting robots like immediately after he comes out of that simulation.
Right. The other thing that I love, the second thing that I love, is that it's something that comes up but hasn't been really pointed out in the book. He doesn't go out of his way to point it out just yet. I'm sure that's coming. But there are laws of humanity in this instead of the laws of robotics.
Yeah.
And one of them is clearly that no human shall harm a robot, which I think is a really, really good inversion. Like, it's a very good sci-fi hook. The third thing that I really like about it is that there's a moment where a robot is trying to determine whether Magnus is human, and she makes him read a CAPTCHA. And it's one of the funniest things that I have seen in comics.
It's the one moment of the issue that is, like, full-on Fred Van Lente funny. Like, a lot of this book is played pretty straight, you know? But the moment where, she validates that he's a human by making him read a CAPTCHA, as though robots wouldn't be able to read a CAPTCHA, is pretty amazingly great. I loved that moment as well. And Like, when he actually does read the CAPTCHA, he's verified it as a human, but that's a bad thing.
Yeah, and I think the implication is that he has trouble reading it. Like, the way it's actually lettered in the book is there's like a long pause,
Yeah.
and he's kind of asking a question as he says it.
Yeah, I don't know if that means he's confused or he's having a hard time.
Well, he's never seen a CAPTCHA before.
Yeah.
But it's a very, very funny scene. And I think it's a very clever twist on the idea of, okay, what would a robot do to determine if someone was a human? Well, they do what we do to determine whether people are humans or robots. We do that all the time.
Yeah.
Love it.
That's a really fun moment. I'm hoping for more stuff like that in the issues to come, because
it's a strong first issue. I would say, like, I think we've been spoiled by Fred Van Lente, because we've gotten, you know, that first issue of G.I. Joe was amazing, and that first issue of Archer and Armstrong was amazing, and the first issue of Power Man and Iron Fist that he did was amazing. It's like every first issue he does is amazing. So when we get one that's like great, it's like, oh, you know, oh, it ended right when it was getting fun.
I think I'm spoiled on Van Lente humor-wise. I kind of go into the stuff he writes expecting a certain degree of laughter that's going to happen. And when he plays it straight, it's a little disappointing, yet I know that that's going to happen sometimes. Like, I don't think his G.I. Joe comics are as humor-filled as, like, Archer and Armstrong either.
They're close.
Yeah.
They're...
but I always appreciate that from him. So when there's not as much of it, I don't feel let down, but I don't know, my expectations don't always feel met. And that's a more a me thing than a him thing. To hear the full episode of War Rocket Ajax that is going up Monday, you better, I guess, wait till Monday, and then go to warrocketajax.com or to iTunes, and there is where you can find the full episode. We've got checks and recs like always. We've got a huge segment of us taking your suggestions for our Every Story Ever list and adding some more entries to that huge list of every comic story ever published, ranked from best to worst. And we've also got some other fun stuff to talk about. So Monday at noon Eastern Time, go to warrocketajax.com or itunes.com and get that episode. Thanks for listening to this early edition of War Rocket Ajax here on ComicsAlliance.com. We'll see you all next week.